Yes. Okay. So there are still people coming in, and they'll probably come in as I speak my short introduction and hand over to Manuel. So welcome everybody to, thank you for coming to the 2020 Annual Race and Resistance Lecture, which is unusual this year because we're doing it, of course, in a different way, but which will be as exciting and interesting as ever, I'm sure. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Manuel to introduce our speaker, who we're very privileged to have this evening, Professor Vincent Brown from Harvard University. But before I do that, I'd just like to say a couple of other things. So you may be interested to know a little bit about the Annual Race and Resistance Lecture. This is the 14th year that we've run it, and it comes about as a result of an MA program at the University of Leeds in the School of History that was initiated and organized originally by Professor Kate Dossett, which involves a team of tutors at Leeds interested in histories of race and forms of resistance and rebellion in a variety of different regional and thematic settings. Our first lecture in 2006 was delivered by Paul Gilroy, and since then we have had a range of great speakers, including Hazel Carby, Kenneth Perry, and Coral Boyce Davies. Each year we have also had quite a large and wide-ranging audience, and it seems that this year is not going to be any different. Our lecture today also coincides fortuitously with the UN International Day for the Abolition of Slavery, which falls on the 2nd of December. And this goes back to the date of the adoption by the General Assembly of the United Nations Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Persons and the Exploited of the Prostitution of Others, which was passed on the 2nd of December 1949. The aim of the resolution was the eradication of contemporary forms of slavery, and I can paste the link into the chat if people are interested in that as well. Finally, I just want to say a few things about how things will run this evening. Professor Brown will talk for about 30 minutes or so, and after that we'll open the floor, as it were, for audience questions. I'd be really grateful if you could either put your question in the chat, the Q&A chat box, or indicate there that you'd like to ask a question orally. If we need you to talk a bit more about your question, we may invite you to do that as well, and we have control over, as it were, the audio from our end. Could I also ask people to keep their questions reasonably succinct if possible, to give others a chance to contribute? I think we'll probably run the questions for around 25 to 30 minutes, but Manuel will be taking charge of that as well. So thank you very much everybody for coming, and thank you very much especially to Professor Vincent Brown. I'm going to hand over to Manuel, who will now introduce our speaker for this evening.
Okay, Will, many thanks. So basically, I'm going to try to be as quick as I can as well. Today we have with us Professor Vincent Brown, who is one of the most important historians of the history of Atlantic and African slavery of our time, I would say. He's also a dear friend, which is something that I deeply appreciate as well. Professor Brown is a Charles Warren Professor of American History and Professor of African American Studies. He directs the History Design Studio and teaches courses in Atlantic History, African Diaspora Studies, and the History of Slavery in the Americas. Brown is the author of The Reaper's Garden, a book that I deeply recommend as well, Death and Power in the War of Atlantic Slavery, and the producer of Herskovits at the Heart of Blackness, an audiovisual documentary broadcast on the PBS series Independent Lens. Most recently, he has authored the book Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war, which is the one he will be talking to us about today. So without further ado, I'm going to give the word to leave the room to Professor Brown.
Thank you, Manuel, Professor Garcia, my good friend. I very much appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the invitation to speak to you all today. You know, we celebrate this December 2nd, 1949, as a date that the UN recognized the suppression of slavery in law and the bondage of others. And oftentimes when we go to think about or commemorate those dates, we are usually talking about transformations in law, transformations that states recognize, transformations that elite policymakers have made, we don't necessarily think as well about the processes that make those kinds of transformations possible, the processes that make those laws transform. And one of the things that's most important in those processes is the political activity of the enslaved themselves. And so what I want to talk to you about today is an important but relatively little known rebellion called Tacky's Revolt, which was in fact the largest slave revolt in the 18th century British Empire. Historians know it fairly well, but the general public does not. And this despite the fact that Tacky's Revolt had a major influence on the emergence of abolitionism in late 18th century Britain. It had a significant influence on the emergence of anti-Black stereotypes and anti-Black militarism in the Anglophone Atlantic world. And it also happened to be one of the major battles of the 7 Years' War, which was that global campaign that Great Britain fought against Spain and France and Holland as well, that Winston Churchill dubbed the First European World War, and historians have known it that way ever since. And yet Tacky's Revolt is rarely considered as part of that First European World War. So I think that really kind of leads us into the central problem that I faced in writing this book, which is the limitations of our geographic historical imagination. We tend to think that continents and states have distinct histories, are distinct from each other. And we don't as often look at the interconnections between them, look at the entanglements of one state with another and one region with another. We tend to operate, right, as if one could distinguish Europe from Africa, from America, right, through these kind of invidious distinctions that the scholar Edward Said inveighed against a generation ago, that see these histories as being held apart. And Tacky's Revolt is a history that unites them. And so I think fundamentally, one of the things that I was trying to do in writing this book was think about how we could integrate the history of West Africa with the history of Europe, with the history of the Americas in a way that was concrete by looking at how this revolt tied them together. So going back a step, as I said, Tacky's Revolt was the largest slave revolt in the 18th century British Empire. And it was led by Africans from what was then called the Gold Coast, roughly what's now contemporary Ghana. And people from that region of West Africa had developed by the mid-18th century an Atlantic-wide reputation for staging revolts, really from Suriname all the way up to New York City, from the last 3/4 of the 17th century through the first 2/3 of the 18th century. They staged revolts all across the Americas, with Tacky's Revolt in 1760 and 1761 being among the largest of those revolts. Now, one of the reasons why these Africans were so involved and engaged in revolts throughout this region is because that was a particularly war-torn region of the African coast. Now, it was war-torn for a number of reasons. There were a variety of African polities vying with each other for supremacy behind the coast. And one of the things that they engaged was traffic with the Europeans on the Atlantic coast. The Europeans would often trade as one of their prize and principal commodities, firearms, which both expanded the scale and the lethality of these African conflicts. Now, anytime any of these African polities went to war with each other, oftentimes soldiers would be captured, enslaved, sold to the Europeans, along with others who had either evaded or escaped or otherwise were displaced by these African wars. And those people came out to the Americas and sometimes they regrouped. Oftentimes former enemies coming together in new categories of belonging because they worshiped similar gods and spoke similar languages or recognized similar kinds of political authority vis-a-vis other Africans, and then staged their revolts against plantation society, which had their knock-on reverberations around the Atlantic basin. Now, these people from the Gold Coast were then known as Coromantese. And so this revolt in 1760, Tacky's Revolt, is one of the largest of these Coromantese wars of the 18th century. Now, I faced a challenge with this because mostly this revolt had been written about as a slave revolt in a particular parish on the island, engaging blacks and whites, so a kind of a kind of an archetypal conflict between masters and slaves. And it had been known as Tacky's Revolt, has been known as Tacky's Revolt for really nearly 250 years, because the first history of this revolt was written by a Jamaican planter named Edward Long in 1774, who identified Tacky as one of the principal African leaders, and identified the revolt as mainly taking place in the northern parish of St. Mary, on the windward side of the island. Now, that framing of the revolt tends to limit its scale and scope to something that happened, as I said, between masters and slaves on particular plantations and in particular parishes of the island, or even within particular colonies. But I also contended with another source that I found that was beyond Edward Long's history. And that was a source that emerged from the diary of the plantation overseer Thomas Thistlewood, who any of you who have studied Jamaican slavery will know is kind of one of the primary sources for the study of slavery in 18th century Jamaica. Because Thomas Thistlewood, an English overseer, came to Jamaica in 1750 and resided there until 1786, leaving a diary of that entire kind of 3.5 decades of experience as an overseer and slaveholder in Jamaica. He himself was in the parish of Westmoreland on the western and leeward side of the island during Tacky's revolt, helped to suppress it as a member of the militia, and then left his account in his diary of his experiences there. One of those stories that he told was of another leader, not Tacky, a man whose name was Wager, but also a man whose name was Wager, but was also named Apongo, which was his African name. And in Thistlewood's account of Apongo's time, he recounted a remarkable story that transforms our understanding of what slave revolt is really about, frankly. He says that Apongo, as a military official in West Africa when he was there, was accustomed to visiting and trading with the father of Thistlewood's employer, a man named John Cope Sr. John Cope Sr. had been the chief agent of Britain's principal trading fort on the Gold Coast, Cape Coast Castle. And Apongo had traded with John Cope Sr. and then was afterwards enslaved, sold to the Europeans, and he came out to Jamaica. This is after John Cope Sr. had retired himself from the Royal African Company, had set himself up on a Jamaican plantation. And when Apongo was himself captured, enslaved, sold to the Europeans, and came to Jamaica, he again encountered John Cope on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And John Cope, remarkably, would lay out a tablecloth for Apongo for Sunday visits and treat him as a man of honor, even though he was now enslaved, and insinuate that when Apongo's master came back to the island, Apongo's owner was a Royal Navy ship captain, John Cope Sr. would have Apongo redeemed and sent home. Now we know that Apongo, who was renamed Wager after one of the ships of that Royal Navy sea captain's commands, we know that Apongo, Apongo's master did not return to the island, and in 1756, John Cope Sr. dies before Apongo's master comes back to the island. And somewhere between 56 and 1760, Apongo Wager becomes one of the principal leaders of this largest slave revolt in the 18th century British Empire. So this is an episode that reminds us that slavery is not just, that slave revolt is not just something that happens in these local arenas. It's something that happens on a much larger scale, across a much wider canvas. It reminds us, frankly, that this slave revolt was part of a much wider series of wars. It was a war within many other wars. So certainly it was what we typically think of as a race war between masters and slaves, because the slaves happened to be Black in Jamaica. It was also an outgrowth of those slaving wars that I discussed in West Africa, where anytime West African polities went to war, people would be enslaved and sold to the Europeans. It was also, in fact, a kind of communal war among Africans themselves, right, whose conflicts didn't necessarily end when they left West Africa, when they came out to the Americas, but transformed. And so there were struggles among the enslaved, even as part of Tacky's revolt, that one sees when one examines it closely and when one examines it in a transatlantic framework. it was also, as I said at the outset, one of the largest battles of the 7 Years' War. And in that, it was a major episode in the imperial war that Europeans were fighting amongst each other, both to command territory in the Americas and around the world, defend that territory from other European powers, and to command the fruits and the benefits of the slave trade. Now, I'm following in the footsteps of several other scholars, including my friend Manuel Barcia, John Thornton, and Paul Lovejoy, and others, who have been trying to tell us that what we need to do is think about the extension of West African history into the Americas, to take that seriously. And there we're kind of dealing with a very old prejudice that I think dates back at least to the early 19th century, when the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel proclaimed that Africa forms no historical part of the world. And when the academic disciplines were set up in the later 19th century in Europe and in the United States, it's true that African history didn't feature very prominently within the historical profession. Africa was the province of anthropologists, and Black people in the Americas or elsewhere were the province of sociologists, and Black people were generally considered as problems for the nation state. Black history and African history didn't really begin to feature prominently within the historical discipline until the mid-20th century, and really until the decolonization of African states and the civil rights movements of the United States and elsewhere. So we're really starting behind when we come to kind of reincorporate African history into the mainstream of the historical discipline. And one can see this, right, just in an episode like the 7 Years' War, which European and American historians have acknowledged is a crucially important event of the 18th century, perhaps one of the most important events, in some ways precipitating the coming of the American Revolution. And yet the major study of the 7 Years' War, Fred Anderson's nearly exhaustive 700-page history of the event, doesn't mention Tacky's Revolt at all, despite the fact that many of the same soldiers, sailors, Marines who fought in the more celebrated conflicts of the 7 Years' War in Quebec, in Senegal, in Martinique, and Guadeloupe, then went to Jamaica to suppress Tacky's Revolt. In fact, the British Royal Marines, who were newly reorganized for the 7 Years' War to fight amphibious campaigns, right, fought their first battles in Senegal, in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and in Jamaica. So they learned their first lessons about amphibious warfare fighting Black people in the bush. And yet you do not see this reflected in the military historiography of Great Britain or of the Royal Marines for the most part. So you can see that we're kind of dealing with a framing issue that is largely, as I said, about our geographic imagination, about our inability to fully understand, absorb, and contend with the consequences of African history in the Americas. And so again, as I said, I'm following the footsteps of my colleagues like Manuel Barcia, who have been trying to document connections between African history and American history as precisely as we can. So we're not left with just merely the kind of vague assertions that African culture mattered in the Americas, that transformations of African into African-American culture are something that one can witness in cultural patterns, but that one really needs to think about the rise of various African empires. In the case of my story, Dinshida, Akwamu, Ashanti, the Fante Confederacy on the Gold Coast of West Africa. That those matter in terms of how history plays out in America. The political history of West Africa matters in the Americas. I think that's very crucial to remember. Now, I think as in my kind of last few minutes, I'll just say a word about the sources, because it is true that one of the other things that we face, one of the other difficulties that historians of this subject face, is that, you know, we're working with sources that were produced by the slave rebels' enemies, frankly. Thomas Thistlewood was a brutal overseer, if perhaps not atypically so. Edward Long, who wrote that first history of the revolt, hated Black people, and he especially hated Africans. In part, he was inspired, right, in that hatred by his encounter with Tacky's Revolt. Brian Edwards, who wrote a subsequent history of Tacky's Revolt, drawing on Edwards, but also drawing on his own experience in Jamaica, also was an enemy of the slave rebels. And it's no coincidence that Brian Edwards also wrote the first English language account of the Haitian Revolution that happened 3 decades later. So these sources we have to read against the grain, trying to determine things that slaveholders didn't necessarily want to tell us. they also have to be read along the grain to see how they inevitably constrain and shape our knowledge of these events. So the story becomes not just the story of these African rebels, not just the story of their African history, but also the story of how we know about them through the stories told by slaveholders, right? So we have to use different kinds of evidence. In this book that I've written, what I tried to do was think about movement as a kind of source, to really line up all the descriptions of the ways that these African rebels moved around the landscape of Jamaica, and frankly across the ocean and in the landscape of West Africa, in order to discern what I could about their strategic logic, their tactics, and their designs on the landscape. And what I learned is, again, confirmation of what other historians I think have learned who've studied similar subjects. They were drawing upon their West African military experience in the revolt in Jamaica. They had designs on the Jamaican landscape, right? They were quite different from those of the slaveholders, trying to set up their own independent, semi-autonomous communities that they could defend from the slaveholders, but also defend from other Black people who had set up their own semi-autonomous communities. And we can talk about that in Q&A if you want, the kind of conflicting role of Maroons in these conflicts. So that became a way of kind of really digging in and thinking about how it is this revolt played out from Africa across the Atlantic and into Jamaica. With, and I think I should end on this, with serious consequences that I think haven't been fully absorbed. So the revolt was brutally suppressed by 1761. It was largely extinguished, even though there were aftershocks throughout the 1760s. The British managed to kill about 500 men, women, and children in their suppression of the revolt, and they also exiled about 500 more. Those exiles went to various places around the Atlantic Basin. Many of them went to what was then called British Honduras, what's now the country of Belize, where 4 or 5 years after Tacky's revolt, there was another slave revolt, probably involving people who had been veterans of the campaigns in Jamaica. At least one other ship went to Virginia. And while we don't know exactly where they went, and we know some went to South Carolina as well, we can be sure that just like those who went to British Honduras, they carried their stories with them, and that would have informed the political activity of the enslaved in North America. We also know that enslaved people were telling each other these stories about Tacky's revolt across generations. There's another episode from the early 19th century in which one planter had received some Africans through the transatlantic slave trade as recruits to his plantation, as captives to his plantation. And they rose up almost immediately after they got there and attempted to stab their driver. In corralling these rebels and interrogating them, he learned that they had been told, even though they had only recently arrived in the island, they had been told all about revolts that had happened in the 1760s. Before any of the Africans who were even still there in the early 19th century had been born. So obviously we can get a sense of an oppositional political history being taught and learned on Jamaican plantations, right? Across the generations, which I think is quite remarkable. Now that gives us insight into an event that happened 30 years later in the nearby colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. We know that many enslaved rebel exiles also were sent to French Saint-Domingue, smuggled across to Saint-Domingue. We know that one of the principal leaders of the first outbreak of the Haitian Revolution in 1791 was a man named Belknap, who himself had been enslaved in Jamaica. I think it's easy to surmise that Belknap, too, would have known of these events of the 1760s. And that would have been part of the story that he told when he arrived in Saint-Domingue, and partly could have inspired some of the rebels in the Haitian Revolution, at the outset of the Haitian Revolution. So that's on the side of the enslaved. But one can also look at the consequences for the system of slavery itself. We know that many people were sympathetic to the plight of the rebels. This was an era in Great Britain of kind of romantic sentiment in literature. And so many people kind of were sympathetic to when they saw evidence and they read reports of the mass killings and executions, summary executions of these rebels. And many people even thought they were martyrs. This helped to animate some of the anti-slavery and anti-slave trade sentiment that begins to well up in Great Britain in the late 18th century. Now, of course, it also does the reverse. It inspires among Long and Edwards, but also many others, a kind of fear of Africans as a social danger, as a threat. And so you get many targeted laws passed in North America to limit the amount of people that can be imported in the course of the slave trade, right? In Pennsylvania, in Virginia, and other places, people are passing laws in order to raise high taxes on newly arrived imports as a security measure. So it's a kind of anti-immigrant security measure. And these become, in fact, some of the first legislative acts that seek to limit the slave trade. And in fact, in Pennsylvania by 1780, in part responding to what had happened in Tacky's Revolt and what Pennsylvania legislature knew about it, they begin to pass these laws to ban the slave trade. Now, finally, we can see that it also stimulated British policymakers to reorganize the empire. Now, this is down to the larger consequences of the 7 Years' War. We know this from the historiography of the American Revolution, that the British expended so much defeating the French and the Spanish in the 7 Years' War. They were disappointed in the participation of the North American colonists and thought that these colonies should pay more for their own defense. And so they began to reorganize the empire. One of their principal concerns was also this revolt in Jamaica, which had been, and still was, the most profitable, one of the most militarily significant, and best politically connected colonies in the Americas. So the British policymakers who passed a new round of legislation in order to reorganize the empire had Jamaica and had the turmoil in Jamaica in mind when they went to pass this new legislation. And I don't have to tell historians of the American Revolution that this new legislation, this new imperial policy, is one of the things that North American colonists revolted against in the 1760s and the 1770s, precipitating the American Revolution. So again, the indirect and knock-on consequences of Tacky's Revolt in the political history that the enslaved told each other, in the rise of the anti-slave trade and abolition movement, and in the reorganization of the British Empire that helped precipitate the American Revolution, all bear some of the imprint of Tacky's Revolt, and therefore some of the consequence of African history that I think hasn't been fully understood and fully appreciated in the way that I think we ought. So with that, I'll end and leave it open to Q&A for the rest of our time.
Many thanks, Vince. Okay, so we are going to we are going to be taking questions now. So you can either raise your hand or you can type your questions in the chat. So if anybody has any questions. Okay, people are not coming through yet, so I'm going to start, Vincent. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah.
So I have a quick question. Actually, I have several questions, but there is one in particular that struck me as something important. You were talking about this case in which Africans rose up in the ship immediately after arriving, and I keep thinking about this African experience of warfare in Africa, and you know that I have an interest on this issue of concepts and categories for a while. And this is a different thing. I promise you, I'm not asking you the same thing that I always ask you. And we're not going there. But this actually is sort of related, and it has to do with the categories that we use to define things from our perspective. And we keep talking about this men, women, and children as enslaved. Before we used to call them slaves, etc., etc. And sometimes I'm actually thinking, how did they think themselves about themselves? You know, what did they call themselves? Because if you and the thing that I keep thinking about is if you were a soldier in an army in Africa, anywhere in Africa, and you are seized by another African army and taken to the coast and sold and on the shores, you may still consider yourself as a prisoner of war, for instance. this is just one category that comes to mind. Maybe they didn't see themselves. And as we know, in some cases, entire groups are crossing the Atlantic together as well, with the people who were in their own companies, etc., etc. So, what do you think about this? Do you see any value in questioning this? And yeah.
No, I think it's a great question. I think it's one that's obviously difficult to answer. I think, kind of the way one would answer that is if you had text produced, or even kind of sources produced by the enslaved themselves. I know in your work you've gotten a little bit closer to that by looking at testimony in these enslaved trials, but of course those are highly coerced confessions and statements, and they're appealing to a particular audience at a particular time. But I think that leads to part of my answer, which is that how people define themselves, right? How people identify is partly going to depend on who they're talking to, right? What setting they're in. So one can think about a process of identification, right? Depending on the setting, the particular predicament people find themselves in, and the particular audience they are speaking to. So one of the things that you know from your study of slave trial records is that people often have many names, right? And they go by various of these names in different communities. So, you can find some person coming into court several times, and they may have 3 or 4 or 5 aliases, depending on kind of what communities know them. And I think that's an interesting thing, right? Because then we're talking about how people who already, given the turmoil of the West African coast during the era of the slave trade, given the turmoil of enslavement and slavery itself, given the ethnic diversity of these slave societies that are constantly receiving wave after wave of immigrants, right? People had to speak multiple languages. They had to identify with multiple people in different communities. And so, if they were talking to an overseer, and if they didn't want to cause trouble, certainly they might refer to themselves as a slave, right? So as not to kind of create a challenge that's gonna, basically get you killed or get you beaten, right? But in their own communities, they would probably refer to themselves, right, with their African ethnic inscriptions, with their African names, or with kind of new categories that they were using at the time. So in the early 19th century, there's one source, or late 18th century, excuse me, there's one source that describes a Maroon who talked about, having a small Maroon colony where there were people of all different colors, like black, yellow, brown, white, right? So he was using a kind of racial ascription, but, right, to describe a political community that was inclusive and diverse. So it wasn't as if this was just a black community of Maroons. This was a community of, that defined themselves as Maroons and then also defined themselves as being people of many hues. So I think we want to remain alive to the multiple identifications that people would have had in various situations. And that can shape our intuition when we find sources that give us an indication of how people were identifying. I guess the kind of best way to summarize that, to put an exclamation point on it, is to say that what we're interested in is the process of identification rather than a fixed identity, right, that one could ascribe to people.
Yeah, thank you. So we have questions now. First, we have Sherilyn Haggerty. She's asking you, how come a Pongo was enslaved in the Gold Coast?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the way kind of any Africans usually got enslaved is, as I said, often because different polities went to war and war captives were sold. Also because people were displaced by wars or also by famine or drought or social and state collapse, and they became vulnerable to others. I mean, if you look, there are tens of millions of slaves in the world today. And generally the way that they lose the protection of communities is their states or their kin groups are weakened, right, by various kinds of social collapse, prominent among them war, and then they no longer can gain protection from these sources of communal belonging, right? And once they become vulnerable to the predation of others, they become enslavable. And like the most obvious and present example is all the people who've been enslaved in Syria recently as a result of the war, the civil war, and social collapse there. So if you think about that process, just kind of magnify that to a region of the West African coast in which it's enormously profitable for Europeans to be selling weapons, firearms into the coast to increase the scale and lethality of these wars, to enhance the kind of social chaos that attends to it, which displaces ever more people who become vulnerable to that kind of predation and enslavement. And more particularly in Apongo's case, Thistlewood writes that he was captured and taken prisoner while hunting, probably by an enemy, by soldiers from an enemy polity, and then hustled to the coast and enslaved before anybody from his own kin group could redeem him.
Yeah. We have two questions here about sources. So the first one is, they are quite interrelated. The first one is from Esther Okorosha, and she says, hi, Professor Brown. Hi, Professor Brown talked about how many of the sources come from the enemies of the enslaved. Are there any sources that come from the enslaved themselves that have also survived from that time? And then we have one from Owen, no surname or name, I'm not sure. And he's asking, when looking at primary accounts of Thomas Thistlewood and Edward Long, what are the main historical techniques you use to overcome the obvious problematic narratives they leave behind?
Yeah, those are great questions, thanks, and questions I wrestle with a lot. So the sources that we all try to use are, we like to find evidence of at least enslaved people speaking to people who would transcribe their words. Often that's in court. And as I indicated in my previous answer, one has to be very careful about how one uses those court records. But I will say also that kind of one of the keynotes to the book is a famous source by the formerly enslaved Olaudah Equiano, then known as Gustavus Vasa, who wrote one of the most famous autobiographies in the English language in the late 18th century. He had been enslaved. He had been also a sailor aboard a Royal Navy warship, and he became a celebrated abolitionist by the late 18th century. And he described slavery as itself a state of war. And he said that when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. So Equiano's voice as a formerly enslaved person is the kind of voice that establishes my entire framework for thinking about Tacky's revolt as a war within other wars. So there's one example. When we have those kinds of sources, we try to use them. We try to use them as well as we can. We also try to take those sources produced by the rebels' enemies, by the slaveholders, and situate them in their context. Think about how those sources were shaped by the world that they confronted. So rather than looking at them as if they transparently reflected what was happening, try to think about, use all the kind of sources we find around them to get a sense of the predicament of those people who made the transcription, who actually gave us the source, like a Thomas Thistlewood, right? And when one does that, one sees a narrative like Long's or like Edwards or like Thistlewood's, for that matter, partly as a product of the fear of their encounter with the actions of slave rebels, right? So one doesn't just take their word for it. One tries to imagine like what they were confronting, so that one sees those sources as being shaped by processes that are outside of their control. And the way I analogize this in the book, it's like, trying to examine, the contours of a stone to get a sense of how wind and water made its shape, right? We know that wind and water, though invisible, were the forces that give a stone its shape, but we have to infer that from the shape of the stone itself. And that's what I do with these slaveholder records. Now, partly that means not just taking these narrative accounts in a diary or in a slaveholder's historical account for granted. One also looks at the letters. One also looks at military official records. One also looks at newspaper accounts. One also looks at mundane plantation records. One of the ways that I tried to reconstruct the experience of Apongo on the West African coast was by looking at the receipts of castle expenses in Cape Coast Castle, just to look at who they were entertaining and how much they expended entertaining foreign traders, entertaining African dignitaries and diplomats. And from those receipts of castle expenses, I got a pretty good idea of the kind of patterns of trade on the Gold Coast. Now that's a pretty mundane record. That's not narrative. It's not, it's not trying to make a point. It's only trying to talk about expense. It's only trying to account for expenses. And yet, when one situates that among other sources, one can get a much better picture, a fuller picture than that source by itself would have to tell you.
Right. Now we have a question from Olga Clark. Do you see, you're going to love this one. Do you see connections between 1760s Tacky Revolt and contemporary urban culture in Jamaica and Louisiana, Georgia, Texas, etc.? And she's talking about dance hall, subculture, rap.
Sorry, say the first part of the question again.
So, do you see connections between 1760 Tacky's Revolt and contemporary urban culture in Jamaica and Louisiana, Georgia, Texas, etc.? And she's referring, I think, to dance hall, talk culture, rap.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, the way I would look at that is to say that, you know, Tacky's Revolt and the history that it describes is kind of part of a larger process of the transformation of African politics, history, and culture in the Americas. When one tries to draw direct links, though, between something that happened in the mid-18th century and the present, the danger is that you miss all the more proximate, right, influences and causes on those things. So I would say kind of the most important thing to remember is that's how we get all these Black people in the Americas, is through this process, right, shaped by the slave trade and the politics of slavery. Now, what happens after that, right? The anti-Black militarism that grows out of that, the racial discrimination that grows out of that, the economic inequality that grows out of that, and of course, the kinds of cultural practices that people bring with them from Africa and that transform in the Americas come down to us in the present as the kind of variety of forms of Black cultural life that we see. But I think it's probably misleading to say one can draw a direct link between something as specific as Tacky's Revolt and something as specific as dance hall, right? One can certainly draw the indirect link between the presence of Black people and Africans in Jamaica and an expression of Black cultural form like dance hall. But that's you know, speaking of a kind of general influence as opposed to a particular causal influence.
Right. Next, we have Gemma Sherwood. She says, thank you so much for a great talk. Do you think that stories demonstrating Black agency, such as Tacky's Revolt, are marginalized from mainstream narrative of abolition taught in Britain as part of a defensive tactic to preserve the predominance of abolitionist saints like Wilberforce? In essence, as part of an effort to alleviate white guilt over enslavement by focusing on manumission.
Yeah, so I think that is what happens, and that's an accurate description of the state of things. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think it's a plot. I think that kind of what happens is people know a certain story, and they're comfortable with a certain story, and certain kinds of stories make them feel a certain kind of way, right? We like to think about Wilberforce because he's a credit to the history of Great Britain. We like to think about the anti-slavery activities of the Royal Navy in the 19th century, and they were prolific, and you can read Manuel Barcia's new book to learn a little bit more about those. But we don't as often think about the 18th century role of the Royal Navy in maintaining slavery and maintaining the entire political economy of slavery, and in this case, suppressing slave revolts quite brutally. I'll just remind you that one of the leaders of this slave revolt was himself enslaved to a Royal Navy ship captain who owned a Jamaican sugar plantation, right? That's not a story that is as convenient to self-congratulatory national narratives, because often what nationalist stories want from history is a story, as I said, which is a credit to the nation, right? Which suggests that who we are as a nation, right, is great and good, and that great goodness stretches all the way back into history. I think a more mature way of thinking about history is not just to kind of identify the heroes and villains of our past and lionize the heroes and excoriate the villains, but to think about that historical complexity, right? Now, that's going to require thinking both about how Great Britain acquired its wealth and its political influence throughout the world on the backs of enslaved Africans, right? It's also going to require us to acknowledge that, like, and then other people made good policy decisions, right? We have to, account for the fact that Winston Churchill, for example, was a racist and an imperialist. He was also instrumental to defeating the racist imperialist Nazis. Both things are true, right? We could extend that story around the world. Joseph Stalin was a brutal tyrant, probably responsible for the death of 20 million Russians. His reorganization of the Soviet Union was also more crucial than Churchill's, right, to defeating the racist, imperialist, tyrannical Nazis, right? We have to be able to understand historical complexity understand it, not in such a way that we're just looking to the past to create self-congratulatory myths, but really looking to the past to understand the processes which got us to where we are today.
Thanks, Vince. So now we have a question from Bethan Fisk. He says, I'm fascinated by the experience of exiles and its suggestions for how we understand movement and larger connections between Jamaica and other spaces in the diaspora. Did these folks continue to identify or be identified as African nations when in Belize and North America, or did they refer to themselves as Jamaicans, or were they referred to as such in these locales?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's one I deal with extensively in the book. And the answer is that transforms over time, those identifications, and according to the situation, as I indicated in my earlier answer. But one of the things that I contend with is that reputation of the Coromontes, right? The Coromonte is a kind of ethnic group, a national group in the Americas that doesn't exist in the same way on the Gold Coast, where people are from various different polities that may be kind of mutually antagonistic. They don't recognize each other as Coromonte. The ethnic group takes its name from Coromontan Fort, right, on the Gold Coast, but that was not kind of an ethnic polity of the same scale and size. And many people that come from various parts of the Gold Coast come together in the Americas as Coromontes, and they identify as such, and they organize as such, and they rebel as Coromontes. Now, that ethnic group has its own kind of semi-autonomous existence. And over time, right, certainly with the end of the slave trade, and as time goes on and more people in Jamaica are, Black people in Jamaica are born in the island, Coromonte comes to mean less and less to people, and it just kind of fades away as an ethnic ascription. So that kind of by the late 19th century, nobody's calling themselves Coromonte.
Yeah. Right, and next we have Oscar Weber. He says, thank you for an excellent talk. I was wondering if Professor Brown may expand on how the news of the revolt impacted nascent abolitionism in Britain and why this impact has been overlooked.
Yeah, so in contradictory ways, right? As I said, there's a kind of upwelling of sympathy, not only in Great Britain, but even in North America, as people learn about the executions of these slave rebels. At the same time, there's a kind of anti-Black racism, right, that's inspired by the violence of these rebels, and both of those things are true. And then, as I said, some of that anti-Black racism actually stimulates some of the first measures passed against the slave trade, to restrict the slave trade, to levy special taxes on the import of captive Africans, especially into North America. So that kind of contradictory experience cuts both ways. I think one of the reasons, and this goes back to the previous question, why we don't think about that complex and contradictory, right, influence on the rise of abolitionism so much, is because it's not the most convenient, conventional story to tell about Thomas Clarkson and, again, William Wilberforce and the Saints and those people in Great Britain, right, who have a kind of an awakening of the conscience, right? That is, again, a kind of much more self-congratulatory national story than this more, kind of conflicting and ambivalent story that features Tacky's revolt as a major influence on abolitionism.
Thank you very much. We have now a question from Ella Cowan. Ella, I'm going to leave your question for the end because I know that Vincent is going to spend a lot of time answering this question, if you don't mind, which is about the Maroon Wars. We leave that one for the end, okay? But you are going to answer it. So next we have Perry Blankson. Thank you for your presentation, Professor. Your colleague John Thornton used the Stono Rebellion of 1739 to make the case that the retention of African cultural traditions by the enslaved facilitated slave resistance. What do you say to those that would argue that the maintenance of cultural links to Africa prevented modes of resistance that threatened slavery?
Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of that argument, and I can kind of try to tell you why briefly. In part, I think it makes too strong a connection between what people see as the identity of the rebels, right, and their politics, and therefore the efficacy of their political struggles. And I think when one looks closer at these rebellions and really tries to kind of sort out the impact that they had at the time on particular conflicts and the response to them, you know, that the easy equation breaks down. To just kind of recreate the argument that I think you're gesturing towards, there's this idea that, you know, kind of African politics is itself kind of atavistic, pre-modern, involved in a backward-looking struggle to recreate African societies, right? Whereas among Creoles, those people born in the island, they have a politics that's more modern, that's kind of more somehow acceptable, that's going to be more successful in these European-controlled states. Now, it's true that in the late 18th century and with the kind of rise of Creole populations, right, there are more people among the enslaved who just speak the languages of their enslavers, right, who may be converted to Christianity, and so can share kind of discourse with the enslavers that the enslavers feel bound to respect, right? They may have to kind of they may have to acknowledge an appeal to Christianity in a way they don't acknowledge an appeal to African spirituality or to African. So there's something to that, but it's too schematic, right? And once one looks at, say, Tacky's revolt, or just let's say a leader like Wager or a Pongo. Wager was certainly an African military official, right? Perhaps with an aim of recreating some kind of African society in a Maroon community, but he was also served aboard a Royal Navy warship for a year. He was also a driver, and not just a kind of enslaved field worker, but a driver on that Royal Navy ship captain's plantation, right? He also, according to sources, didn't want to just go straight to the mountains, as many of the other Africans did, to create that Maroon community. He wanted to go to the port, right? To occupy the strategic gateway to one of the most profitable parishes in the British Empire, right? So this is not somebody who's just trying to kind of, you know, recreate a backward-looking African society, as has been supposed. This is someone who's fully cognizant of the way the world is working at the time, what we would call a modern person. And when one thinks that just simply by understanding the Africanness of these people, one understands the implications of their political activity, you're going to miss all of that, right? You're going to miss all of the ways in which those people have, you know, are fully embedded with, right, this modern world, right? Understand what's happening with Europeans. And also you're going to miss the kinds of consequences, as I've alluded to, in abolitionism, in the reorganization of the British Empire, in the rise of anti-Black militarism, that their actions had, right? So if you're only looking at, you know, well, the later rebellions among the Creoles had a stronger influence on the abolitionist campaigns in Britain, that's true to a degree, but it misses so much of the actual history of these conflicts and why they mattered in the world that it's not, I think, a good place to start.
Okay. So now we have a big question here from David Tepp. Does slavery require the oppressor to see the slave as inferior as persons? Otherwise, how would Christians see enslavement as permissible?
Yeah, I mean, I think when one looks kind of at slavery across time and across the world, these kinds of inequalities, brutally enforced inequalities, tend to lead to legitimating discourses and ideas of the natural inferiority of those people who are being brutalized, of those people who are lesser in rank. So kind of it's always worth remembering that we get the word slave from Slav, because Slavic peoples, right, were among those peoples enslaved in the Black Sea trade to work in the Mediterranean before the fall of Constantinople, and the cutoff of that Black Sea trade to the Mediterranean, and then the movement of the Europeans more deeply into the trans-Saharan trade, and then finally the Atlantic trade in enslaved Africans, right? When by, you know, the later early modern period, right, African people and Black peoples generally come to be associated with slavery. And then all of the kind of stereotypes and understandings of their lesser humanity are imposed upon them because of their social situation, because of their social position. but I do think that kind of, that is not strictly racialized, right? Or I would say it this way, that as part of enslavement, no matter who is enslaved, there's a kind of racialization, right, that attends to it, even when those people are not Black. There's a kind of, there's an imposition of stereotypes and ideas of the inferiority of those people who are in those bodies, no matter who they are.
Yeah. Right. The next question is from we won't be taking more questions. So the ones that are in the chat already, we will address them. Otherwise, Vincent is going to be answering questions for the rest of the day. I know you have other things to do. So we have Ellie Young, who is asking, I haven't finished your book yet, but you use a few descriptions of dress of the enslaved leaders. How useful were these descriptions to your thinking about them?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I didn't get too deeply into that. I mean, that's an important topic for research, and I'm trying to kind of think of some names, but maybe afterwards, if you reach out to me, I can find. Go ahead.
Yeah, there are cases as well in Cuba in the 19th century, several cases in which the descriptions of the clothing of the especially of the leaders, are very clear, and sometimes they even include umbrellas, and as we know, yes, umbrellas in some parts of West Africa were a signature of generals or royalty. So
right, and we know there was a woman actually in Kingston, a Kua, they called her Cuba, the Queen of Kingston, who sat under a canopy, an umbrella, as a kind of a kind of representation of her status. And we know that there are descriptions of the kinds of we call them charms and amulets that Africans wore to confer spiritual protection against the tactics of their enemies. So those things are important, but I can't say that I did a deep dive on the meaning and significance of military dress in this book.
Right. So next is Olivia Wyatt, who is one of our MA students in Race and Resistance. So she says, thanks for such a fantastic talk. You mentioned that enslaved Africans testify in court. Did you unearth any evidence that suggests that they had been tortured or threatened beforehand, as was sometimes the case following failed slave conspiracies or rebellions? Apologies if you have already mentioned this. You haven't. So
yeah. So I haven't in this specific case, but let me kind of start elsewhere, which is a kind of, the kind of conventional definition of slavery offered by the sociologist Orlando Patterson, who studied slavery across time from ancient to modern in, some 66 slave societies, in which he said that, slavery is the permanent violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. And when one focuses on the first part of that definition, permanent violent definition, you understand that violent coercion is at the very heart of how it is that people, are made slaves and subjected to continual enslavement, right? So that coercion is at the heart of every slave person experiences. Now, in the aftermath of a slave revolt, right, it's heightened. And all of these people were threatened with torture. And I guess the kind of shortest way to answer your question is to be a slave meant to be threatened with torture at the outset, right? That is very much a part of the condition of being enslaved, is to be threatened with physical violence. Spectacular and extreme kinds of torture and execution that one witnesses and then one is subject to in the aftermath of the revolt is also kind of one of the elements of coercion in this testimony. And then, yes, to come more directly to your question, they are also individually threatened with coercion if they don't give the answers that the torturers want, right?
That's the case almost everywhere.
Yeah.
Right, next is Lloyd Belton, who is one of our PhD students. Thank you, Professor Brown, for your fascinating presentation. You mentioned how part of your research involved tracing the movements of the Tacky revolt rebels across the island and to understand their military strategies and links to West African warfare. Could you please talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, first I'll direct you to a resource, which is a map that I made that's online in Jamaica, a cartographic narrative. And of movement across the landscape what they wanted from the landscape. One sees their strategic territorial intent. But I can let you kind of play with the map where I've got a longer essay on what I think one learns and one doesn't learn from the map that's attached to it. I think, yes, so, Professor Barcia just put that in the chat.
I just put the link on the chat. Just talking about the Maroons, the question of Ella Cohen was for you to talk a little bit more about the Maroon communities in Jamaica. I think that probably would make sense as well to talk about how the Maroon communities interacted with this movement of Tacky as well.
Yeah, so good. So I spent a lot of time dealing with that in the course of the book, because many of the kind of Maroon communities in Jamaica kind of had their basis among these Gold Coast Africans, also these Coromantes. Kind of to try and tell the story as briefly as possible. Even when the British took the island from the Spanish in 1655, there were kind of rump Spanish forces and also escaped slaves, Africans, who fought British control of the island from the mid-17th century on. Right, the Spanish were finally expelled, but many of these Maroons kind of maintained their encampments in the mountains. And one of the kind of advantages for them of Jamaica was a particularly mountainous and had particularly mountainous and forbidding terrain, which the Maroons could hide out in and use to their advantage in their military campaigns. And over time, as the slave trade increased and as the size of the plantations increased under the British, more people ran away and joined these Maroon communities. The Maroon communities began to grow. Right? Now they have their own politics. They kind of, they exist in different encampments. They have their own different leaders, and they do not always get along or see eye to eye. But by the late 1720s, the Maroons are engaged in a pitched battle, in a series of battles with the British, where the British don't even know that they're going to be able to maintain control of the island in the early 1730s, right? So they're fighting a major war that we call the First Maroon War with these Maroons. The Maroons pursue this war so successfully, but it's also so taxing that they wind up signing a treaty with the British in 1739, which grants them their autonomy, but which requires them by diplomatic treaty to pursue future runaways and return them to the plantations, and also to police future slave revolts, which they in fact do in the context of Tacky's revolt in 1760. So it became pretty clear in researching this revolt that the militia do not prosecute this war very successfully against the rebels, but the Maroons in fact do. It's the Maroons using tactics that are familiar to the rebels that are able to pursue them into the bush and into the mountains far more effectively than either the British Army or the militia. And so the Maroons become crucial to the British effort to suppress Tacky's revolt.
Okay, so the last question, Vince, is from Emily Raven Baker. She says, thank you for your wonderful talk. I am wondering how conflict, war, and rebellion shape the creation or destruction of culture and identity in the Caribbean enslaved populations, compared to other forces such as experiences of living and working in spaces of slavery, like plantations or processes such as marronage.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think worthy of a series of books. But let me just kind of end with this, that I do think that you've got your finger on all the right processes that one wants to look at in order to answer that question. I think the first thing to remember is that this is a world of warfare, that is a highly contested, turbulent, and extremely violent world in which slavery takes place. This kind of idea, I mean, I think this is more prominent in the United States than it is in Great Britain. This idea that one can understand slavery through the kind of bucolic plantation house and the well-ordered gangs of slaves working cotton in the field doesn't account for the disruption and the chaos and the violence that made this world so profitable, in fact, right? The wars in West Africa that facilitated the trade in slaves, the extreme working in gangs on plantations where the death rates were incredibly high. And of course, the kind of periodic eruptions of violence and slave revolt that happened really anywhere you had high concentrations of slaves, but especially where you had high concentrations of Africans who had this military experience. So one wants to account for the turbulence and the violence of that world, right? Anytime one goes to look at the experience of the political economy of slavery. And therefore, it should inform the way we think about the history of empires in this period more broadly, right? That these empires are not just extensions of national priorities and national power and diplomatic politics. They're opportunistic players that are taking advantage of and promoting this kind of violence and this kind of chaos for their own benefit.
Okay, thank you very much, Vince. And so we are going to start closing. I would like to thank you again for being with us today. It's been a pleasure, as always. And thanks to all the participants. We had at some point 120 for being here today as well. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I appreciated your questions. And always a pleasure to be in dialogue with you, Professor Barcia.
Same. Thank you very much.